Thanks everybody for coming to the webinar. Thanks to all of our presenters and to all the attendees. We've over 250 people online, so that's absolutely fantastic. Thanks for joining in. So I'm chairing the webinar. My name is Mark Petticrew. I'm a professor of public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we can introduce the speakers shortly, so we'll hear from everyone very shortly. Just a couple of brief housekeeping things. A recording of the webinar and copies of the slides will be made available after the event. And you should have access to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, which will allow you to post any questions that you have. And I'll try and keep an eye on them and put them to the speakers at the end of the general discussion. And we'd encourage people to vote for questions vote up questions that they want answered, so that we have a way of prioritizing them. So as you will know, you're at a webinar organized by Local Health and Global Profits. And Local Health and Global Profits, LHGP, as you might hear it referred to, is a research consortium working with local governments and civil society groups to better understand and address commercial and closely related socioeconomic and political factors that impact on our health and health inequalities. And as part of the work of Local Health and Global Profits, we're researching how to improve health by addressing the harmful effects of commercial activities and maximising any benefits. And just as a brief advert, to stay up to date with future events and webinars and progress of projects, and also to get access to resources to help local authorities tackle the negative impacts of commercial determinants of health. Follow LHGP on social media and sign up to our newsletter. And links have been posted in the chat. So to the webinar. As many online will know, in 2025, 75% of the UK population were estimated to be using social media, with YouGov data suggesting that 22% of people get their health information from these platforms, and that rises to 40% among Gen Z. While social media enables global connectivity, improved social connectedness and information sharing, there is growing concern about commercial influence, conflicts of interest, other types of vested interests of health-harming industries, and the spread of misinformation and disinformation, as we'll hear. So today in the webinar, with the help of our speakers, we'll be exploring the social media industry as a commercial determinant of health and examine how these platforms drive health outcomes and potential conflicts of interest between the interests of social media companies and public health interests. So we'll hear three presentations on how digital platforms drive the circulation of misinformation and disinformation. And we'll hear about the role of influencers in shaping health information environments. And then, as all of that bad news is too overwhelming, we'll end with positive solutions and ways to challenge and counteract commercially driven misinformation and disinformation. So we'll start, we're just still on time, so we'll start straight away with Dr. Marco Zenone. Marco is Assistant Professor of Health and Science Communication at the University of Ottawa. And Marco will talk about how digital platforms enable the circulation of mis and disinformation, and how the platforms, their design, their incentives, their governance, shape our health information environments. And Marco's research interests include public health misinformation, disinformation, commercial determinants of health more generally, and digital platform governance. So as I say, he'll be discussing digital platforms and the amplification of mis and disinformation. So Marco, if you're able to share your slides.
Here we go. You can see that okay, Mark?
Yep, that looks good and we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So hi, everybody. My name is Marco Zenone. As introduced, I'm the assistant professor at the University of Ottawa. It's always wonderful to be a part of events like this with a very appropriately named the Business of Health Misinformation webinar. So today I'm going to be giving a talk called Adopting an Upstream View on Mis and Disinformation. And I'm going to be sharing some things that I think are essential for you to know about mis and disinformation as you all work in public health or adjacent fields. And as part of that, we can't ignore the role of digital platforms, which are going to be, as Mark mentioned, kind of the spotlight topic of the talk. As I go through my talk, I'm going to have some key messages. If you remember anything from my presentation, I want you to remember those key messages because, again, they're key. So just as a starting point, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about some definitions, even though I know we're all exposed to these terms quite often. But misinformation is any false or misleading content shared without harmful intent, whereas disinformation is any false or misleading content that's spread with an intention to deceive. And I underline this part because we forget this part of the definition. We get really focused on this idea of intent a lot, but it also includes if you're sharing false or misleading information to secure economic or political gain, which is very important to remember when we talk about these issues. So leading into the first key message I want to share with you is that, again, we hear these terms misinformation, disinformation so often, but we often mean disinformation when we talk about misinformation. And what I mean by that is a lot of the misinformation that we're exposed to in public health, whether it's about vaccines or other big health topics around risk or anything like that, they tend to have a disinformation origin if you really peel back the curtain. So just to give you an example of this, we're all probably fairly aware of the fraudulent Wakefield article, which linked the MMR vaccines to autism. And a lot of harm happened from this. We know the paper has been retracted. Wakefield delicensed for his callous disregard for children. But this caused a lot of harm, and it's still kind of an enduring harm that we see again about this relationship with the MMR vaccine with the development of autism, which there's no evidence for at all. But this idea still permeates across social media and in different circles. We also see that this has been advanced by other organizations that have kind of continued to repeat this piece of disinformation. One notorious example of this is the Children's Health Defense. This is a very if I'm honest, just a very horrible organization that shares a lot of disinformation, often to parents, and discourages them to get their children vaccinated. This group was founded by the current U.S. Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and they're very inventive, unfortunately, in the way they shared this information about vaccines and other topics. But why it's so important that we have to recognize that we often mean disinformation when we talk about misinformation is that when we treat false information only as misinformation, so for example, if somebody believes some piece of misinformation around vaccines, we individualize the problem, and we might inadvertently divert attention away from the very often powerful actors who are deliberately manufacturing and getting something out of spreading that disinformation, which often can be very profitable. And that leads me to my second key message for you, is that disinformation is a highly profitable industry, unfortunately. There's no shortage of examples of ways disinformation can be profitable. From the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of digital profiteering in the anti-vax community, where people make anti-vax content on digital platforms or social media, and then they kind of use that attention they get from those topics to sell other products, which can vary from essential oils to different kind of editorial or kind of alternative news outlet subscriptions, but lots of ways that this happens. One of the more interesting ways that this happens is through fake news. So fake news is probably a term we're all somewhat familiar with, but it's kind of the generation of these really bad news stories, with very headline attention kind of titles that get people to click on it. How a lot of these fake news organizations make money is that when people go to the website, they have advertising on the side. And really interesting when it comes to fake news, a lot of times the advertisers that are the ones who are advertising on these websites, they don't actually know they're advertising on the fake news websites. So for example, the study here looks at companies that are inadvertently funding online misinformation and they get consumer backlash, but they also don't intend for their advertisements to be there in the first place. But through the nature of algorithmically distributed advertising, sometimes where they advertise, they don't know where it ends up. The decision makers at a lot of these companies, again, they don't want to be on these fake news websites or other kind of misinformation websites. And they have a strong preference to avoid doing so, but it still happens, unfortunately. And just to give an example of the scale of this, this study, I believe it was from 2019 to 2021, where they actually did their analysis. But they found that about 42,600 companies were advertising on these kind of misinformation websites or fake news websites, and about 9.5 million ads observed in that time frame. So, a terrible problem that's being very much amplified by different algorithmic structures. We see some more enduring forms of disinformation as well. One of the big ones is people selling unproven cures to people in very desperate situations. So think, for example, people with stage 4 cancer and people selling unproven products or advertising services in a way that distorts the likely efficacy of those products. This is a more enduring form of disinformation that we're going to chat about in a little bit as well, that very much intersects with digital platforms. The big elephant in the room, though, is, of course, digital platforms and in particular social media. Social disinformation has unfortunately become part of the social media business model. And it's a big statement to make, but unfortunately, again, one, I think that is true. I also don't think social media platforms intended for this to happen. I think it's been this evolution, unfortunately, that's where we are now. We all probably know how social media platforms work, but most of them make money from advertisements. So they want to keep people on their platform for as long as possible, interacting with their content, so they could show more advertisements. Um, Unfortunately for the world, fear and outrage are some of the most profitable content that keep people on platforms because it tends to evoke very strong emotional responses and keep people on the platform to show more ads. So again, we see this kind of perpetuating cycle of disinformation becoming part of the social media business model. In addition to trying to keep people on the platform, just that kind of action, digital platforms also provide opportunities for disinformation actors to advertise or sell their messages, products, and services. And this happens in many different ways. And I'm going to share some examples of how this happens. But this is, again, a non-exhaustive way or a couple examples that I'm going to share with you. So this is not a social media example, but a digital platform example of Google searches. So this is a study that I did looking at Google searches for information about cancer lead to targeted ads from alternative clinics, which I very much view as more of a disinformation source, often exploiting people, again, in very hard situations. The reason we did this study is when I started Googling these terms, like, for example, terminal cancer treatment, I started seeing these really horrible ads appear. You could see this ad that's I'm looking at right now that says no chemo, no radiation. It's blocked out just for privacy, but this is kind of a known alternative cancer clinic that's been described as predatory in more than one place. But you can see that they're the first result that comes up here. They're displayed alongside a more authoritative source of cancer information, the National Cancer Institute. So what we did with the study is we wanted to see, well, why is this happening? What safeguards are in place to stop it? And really try to understand the extent of this problem, how much it's really happening. And what we found was the reason that this ad was appearing when I searched for terminal cancer treatment is that the content of Google searches are matched to ad keywords. So basically, an advertiser can say, anytime somebody Googles terminal cancer treatment, I want my ad to be shown. So just to show you how easy this could be, this is a fake example that I never posted, or a fake ad rather. You can see my ad, skip chemotherapy, 99% cancer cure rate. And I said, anytime somebody Googles these terms, cancer, stage 4 cancer, then you can see Google actually suggested some other terms that I could use. I want my ad here to be shown. And it was a very, I didn't have to spend a lot of money for this to be successful. So for $10 a day, I could get somewhere between 110 to 240 ad clicks each month. It's important to remember a lot of these alternative cancer clinics that I studied, they don't need many people to actually go through with the services to be profitable because they cost upwards of 40 to 60,000 US dollars for a course of treatment. We found just in 2023 from a very small sample of clinics just in Tijuana, Mexico and Arizona, United States, about 20,000 unique keywords that were found attempting to match these ads that, again, I view as very much a form of exploitation to the Google searches of cancer patients. And this included searches for information on prognosis, accessing conventional treatment, treatment information, diagnosis and living with cancer, cancers, some non-cancer related late and terminal stage cancers, and alternative treatment. And we found, over time, they spent a lot of money on these ads, about $2.36 to get somebody to their website, and a lot of traffic was generated from this. So that's just one example. I want to show you another example of an e-commerce platform now. So this is a search for vaccination on the Amazon e-commerce website in the book section. All 10 of these results that come up, the new releases, the top sellers, these are all horribly misleading books that distort what vaccination is and give pretty poor advice. The first example here is co-published with the Children's Health Defense. It's also worth noting that most of these books are self-published or published with not very reputable publishers. Again, just showing another way where this kind of mis and disinformation can be amplified and be very profitable. So we did a study on this as well, but looking at cancer, because we noticed similarly when we did a search like that, but for cancer, a lot of misleading books came up. So we looked at the top 1,000 books for cancer on Amazon, and we found out 50% of them were misleading. And most of them were misleading in the fact that they tried to give an efficacious claim that they had maybe a cure or a treatment approach for cancer that wasn't evidence-based. You'll notice that most of the misleading books are on the first couple pages. They had the highest proximity of misleading books. Some of these books were just, pretty ridiculous. This is kind of a funny one, Curing Cancer with Carrots. Probably, you could probably spot that this isn't the best book to buy, although a lot of people do buy this book. Some of the other books are kind of harder to tell. There's still red flags with this book here. We can see the author has, some credentials in the bottom corner here is in a lab coat. So, maybe not as easy to spot this one. But the author of this book was just ordered to pay $105 million to a terminal cancer patient because somebody had a curable form of cancer, listened to his advice, and became incurable. Again, this was a book that was for sale after this lawsuit happened. We also see targeted advertising happen across meta platforms, so Facebook and Instagram. This is an interview I gave just, I believe, a couple weeks ago, looking at unproven stem cell interventions for autism and ads that are permeating across different platforms, which often make parents feel like they have to do or get this kind of treatment. And if they don't, they're not doing everything for their kid, even though there's no evidence right now at all for any kind of stem cell intervention for autism. I know everyone's in the UK, so I just wanted to show as well, if I do the same search in the UK, about 1,300 ads for stem cell therapies in the last year or so. So a big problem. And it happens for a lot of different other health conditions as well. And this is anyways, just all to say that digital platforms can enable and profit from mis and disinformation in many different ways. And it's impossible to do all of that in one presentation, but a lot of opportunities. So while all this is happening, where these mis and disinformation is, becoming a big issue of digital platforms, we see this paradoxical situation where, digital platforms are partnering with public health entities like the WHO, like Health Canada, for example, where I'm from, and different other health organizations. And it's a very paradoxical situation because they're profiting from mis and disinformation and amplifying it, the digital platforms, but they're also being expected to help solve the issue. It doesn't make sense when you peel back the curtain. My colleagues and I have written about this, and we've argued that we have to remember sometimes in public health that these platforms, they're not neutral entities, even though sometimes we consider them to be. They're businesses. And it's not a bad thing, of course, but they have different objectives than we're going to have in public health. And we have to be very careful sometimes about how we interact with digital platforms. And one of the reasons we have to be careful is that sometimes these partnerships, if we endorse what they're doing, so for example, giving the WHO more ad space, we can endorse the actions of digital platforms, even though they're not making any structural or underlying changes to what's actually amplifying mis and disinformation. And this can give us some short-term wins, but long-term, probably not what we want. At its core, though, this is also an issue of power. I get why groups like the WHO would reach out to WHO because we don't have much power. to intervene on these. So we're in this horrible situation. We have to appeal to the altruistic nature of digital platforms. And while all this disinformation, misinformation issues are happening, we would hope that digital platforms will kind of be meeting the moment. But unfortunately, we're going the other way, where a lot of the trust and safety teams for these platforms are being cut or just completely removed. So the next key message I want to share with you is that studying and researching misinformation has real risks. We're seeing lawsuits organized by the owners of some social media platforms like Elon Musk suing the Center for Countering Digital Hate. I've had some of my mentors talk about how they've got death threats, they've been sued, they've been lied about for being a prominent misinformation researcher. And this is a kind of a tenure track or a full professor Order of Canada recipient, and it's still very uncomfortable for him. You can imagine for early career researchers how uncomfortable that can be and the risks that are associated with that. We also see in the political realm disinformation researchers being brought into different investigations for their work on political misinformation. And what worries me about this is I worry that there's going to be a chilling effect on the kind of questions we ask, especially when it comes to digital platforms and these very sensitive issues of mis and disinformation. Next key message, it's also becoming harder to study mis and disinformation. To give you an example of this, if I want to get data from a digital platform to study an issue related to mis and disinformation, I have to agree to their terms of service. So for example, with TikTok, I have to give TikTok a copy of my manuscript before I publish. I have to disclose the intent of my research before I receive data access. So think like a grant application with saying these are gonna be my research questions. And I also have to agree to random monitoring, auditing of my use of their tools at any time without notice. So you can imagine if you're doing critical research into these platforms and you have to disclose the intent of this critical research, it's just not a situation that works for most research to be effective. And we see a lot of the different data repositories or tools that did exist, like CrowdTangle, for example, with Meta, being diluted with it now just having 1% of the features it used to. I think in Canada, this is something that we could do better. We have very little data protection access when it comes to digital platforms. The EU is a good example of what we could do with the Digital Services Act, which gives researchers a lot of access to some very important data to understand digital platforms and their impact. The next key message I want to share with you is that terms like infodemic can hold us back. And I learned this from somebody named Tina Pernit, who had a really wonderful LinkedIn editorial that inspired this slide. But an infodemic is an emergency term that's usually meant to deal with the misinformation that spreads about an infectious disease after an outbreak. It's supposed to be a very kind of short-term oriented phrase. It's very small, short-term issue that happens. It's not meant to describe our information ecosystems, but we use this term infodemic quite often to describe this issue or this moment we're in with mis and disinformation. A more helpful way we can look at this is to start looking at our information environments as the problem and making sure we're looking at our information environments from a structural determinant perspective, which sees all different kinds of actors involved who have to keep us safer. This includes people from politics, law, economy, media, education, science, digital platforms, and more. And this is just another way to say we have to stop blaming individuals for this moment we're in or for believing specific instances of mis and disinformation. The next key message I want to share is that mis and disinformation issues are not new. There's a whole history of mis and disinformation. It's not something that just happened in 2016 with the US election or after the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can look to history to inform our approach and specifically look at the history of the disinformation playbook. We can look at the original manufacturers of doubt in the tobacco industry, which perfected the disinformation playbook that was taken up by other industries, sometimes like the pharmaceutical industry with opioids, and many others like the formula industry, asbestos, ultra-processed food, and fossil fuels. And we have to start thinking that disinformation is more than just promoting a piece of false information. It's a sophisticated network of strategies that go beyond, again, promoting a specific piece of false information. It includes things like determining what the evidence base is, what the topics we study are. Again, we have to go beyond just a piece of information and trying to debunk it. A helpful way to look at this is the commercial determinants of health, which I think most people in the call are familiar with, so I'm not going to go into. But a really nice way we can try to understand mis and disinformation more. The next key message is that the harms of mis and disinformation are inequitably distributed a lot of the time, and this is exploited. So we see that a lot of historical mistrust is exploited to encourage people to believe disinformation. So a really good example of this, unfortunately, is this really horrible documentary produced by some anti-vaxxers, which equates the Tuskegee medical experiments to vaccination campaigns encouraging Black men to get vaccinated. We also see this kind of inequities amplified by digital platforms too, where a lot of the moderation tends to focus on content in English, and any kind of content in other languages tends to be not moderated as well, as shown by some internal documents in the last couple of years from Meta. The last key message I want to share with you, and this is probably the most important one, is that we are not going to educate our way out of dis and misinformation. And the reason I put this into the presentation is because we often think that we just have to, have a whole education campaign or use digital platforms to share specific pieces of information. And while using influencers or using ads, it can be a good thing. I don't want to say it's not a good thing, because it is a good thing. It doesn't change anything about the ecosystem. It just kind of makes us compete with disinformation actors, and the ecosystem doesn't change. And as we enter the AI age, where this happens, or where the proliferation of disinformation content is just going to get that much worse, if we think our solution is going to be also to use AI or just compete with all of this bad information, it doesn't work. It doesn't change anything with our structural system. It also doesn't change anything about the broader social conditions that allow misinformation often to fester. A better approach is to disrupt the disinformation economy, make it very hard for people to disinform others, and make sure there's consequences when this does happen. Some other things that I think are important to know that I'm going to go really back some already over time. Avoid the trap of overt misinformation. We often get sucked into debates about things that are true or false, and argue over those. So for example, is climate change real? Most disinformation happens about what we should do about climate change, not whether it's real or not. Mis and disinformation by omission. Sometimes people omit key facts, even though it can present as factual. Make sure we're getting the full context. A bit controversial. I think we need more political economy research in mis and disinformation, less psychology research. Not that psychology research isn't helpful, but when it comes to mis and disinformation, we're putting way too many eggs in that basket. AI is the next wicked problem for dis and misinformation. Not knowing something does not mean somebody believes dis and misinformation. Be very careful when you see surveys where they use this as a method that somebody doesn't know something and they equate it to believing disinformation. And last, at its core, mis and disinformation is an issue of power. We're doing a lot of approaches from a downstream perspective, which again are necessary and they're good, like debunking and pre-bunking. But we have to start doing some more things that are upstream that protect our information environments. You'll have the slides so you can go through these, but we have to pivot there a lot more. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over time.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Marco. Thanks for starting us off with a proper upstream perspective on mis and disinformation. There's a lot we could unpick there, but one of the things that sort of struck me was you raised the issue of language and terminology, and maybe we can come back to that. I think the terms misinformation and disinformation are themselves quite distancing for people and for the public potentially, but you used lots of other ways of referring to it during your talk. You talked about fraudulent science and quack science, and there were very predatory science, and predatory organizations. So maybe we can come back to the issue of communicating about misinformation itself, but there's so much there. We'll keep moving. I'll just remind people to put any questions in the Q&A, and we'll come back to them at the end. And I'll pass over to Dr. Deborah Cohen. And Deborah, following the release of her very recent book, Bad Influence, How the Internet Hijacked Our Health, published in January, I think, Deborah's going to talk about some of the issues that this presents for population health. And Deborah is a medically qualified broadcaster, journalist, editor, and visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. I'm sure many of you have seen her before, or seen and heard her before. She established the investigations unit at the BMJ and has experience across mainstream and academic print, digital, TV, and radio, specializing in complex interventions. And Deborah will talk about, drawing on her book, the role of influencers in spreading misinformation and more of the challenges that this presents for people working in public health. And then, as I say, questions in the Q&A. Thanks, Deborah.
Okay, and someone else is, I think, doing this for me now. Yeah, I'm not,
Okay.
PowerPoint is not a journalist's best friend, so we're not great at them. Anyway, but lovely. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and that was an incredibly hard act to follow. I interviewed both Mark and Nason in the book, but just a little bit background to why I wrote the book. Um, Often in journalism, you know, many things start down in the pub where you're having sort of conversations with people. But this one happened in my hometown, Liverpool. And I was having a conversation. I was at my auntie's birthday party, as you do in the pouring rain, standing under a gazebo. And I happened to start chatting to my cousin's friend. And she had bought an AMH test online, and that's anti-Malarian hormone. And I said to her, and she came, you know, came over to tell me she bought one. And I said, well, why did you do that? And she said, well, the influencer, I said, it was going to tell me about my fertility. And I said, well, is it? And she said, well, that's what they said on Insta. And I said, well, it's probably not, because it's not a measure of fertility. It's used in IVF as a marker of, you know, how well cycles are going on, but it can't predict fertility. But it is marketed heavily online. It's known as the egg timer test. That's sort of how it's colloquial known. And in principle, higher H levels mean more eggs, but it doesn't say whether you're going to have a baby. And that's what she wanted to find out. And what had happened is the marketing of these tests online turned out to be a gateway for egg freezing. And people were offered tests, and the marketing really kicked in. So if you had low levels, it was, well, you need to go and freeze your eggs now. If you had high levels, well, you need to freeze it now where your eggs are high. So it was a gateway to more medical intervention. And I said to her, well, how much did you pay? And she said, oh, I paid 160 quid. And I said, well, what are you going to do if the results are low? And she said, well, I'm going to go and see my GP. And I said, well, what are you going to do if they're normal? And she said, well, I'm going to go and see my GP. And I said, well, you probably wasted 160 quid then. But that same summer, I started speaking to other friends who were looking online for their, you know, HRT or menopause hormone therapy, as we call it now, testosterone, ADHD, looking for full body screening tests. And they were turning, rather than Dr. Google, they were turning to Dr. Instagram or Dr. TikTok to find out what was going on. And one of my friends said to me, well, you really need to look into this. Can you write a book about it? And what I noticed is they were sort of grappling with the same issues as I did as a journalist. What are the benefits of this intervention? What are the harms? What are the uncertainties? And ultimately, who is making the money? What are the conflicts of interest? What is the agenda of this person telling me to have this particular procedure or test? And I went on a bit of a journey. I kept a very open mind when I started it, and I interviewed around 200 people. I interviewed content creators, marketing agencies, people that use social media for health advice. I interviewed academics and doctors. And I looked in the grey literature. I think that there's about 600 references in there. So I did a deep dive into the literature. And for what I saw, for all intents and purposes, is this is what happens when you put health on platforms that are ultimately geared for shopping and advertising and entertainment. And they're built to grab your attention, retain your attention, and ultimately sell. And what became apparent was these spaces were potentially impacting on how we experience symptoms, how we talk about illnesses, what we think of a disorder and what is normal, and what expectations people have from their doctors and ultimately their health services. And I was less interested in the sort of wellness space, and I was much more interested in what seemed like good science and medicine perhaps isn't. So wearables, diagnostic tests, screening, it's all how you interpret evidence, the kind of stuff I've been trying to explain for years. And we talk about the term misinformation. For years, I've sort of made a career of what is the evidence for this claim, and whether that's, you know, Tamiflu, the first investigation I did for the BMJ back in 2009 with the Cochrane collaboration, or claims that fertility clinics were making about add-on treatments for IVF. So I sort of thought about it in that sense. And what struck me is the whole new ways of monetizing health, and this is being played out across social media platforms. So, you know, we know about the traditional players: pharma, devices, food, alcohol, tobacco, fossil fuels. Obviously, I don't want to put those all in the same bucket necessarily. And we're used to them influencing our health via research agendas, what gets studied, what doesn't, what gets published, what gets into the medical literature and what doesn't. We know how they've shaped our understanding of illness and changing thresholds for what is an illness. And they've shaped, clinical guidelines and policies, and that's well documented. But here we've got different big players. We've got big tech platforms, as we've just heard about, and health tech in general, plus influencers, so their own little micro industries, if you like, selling merch, online clinics, pharmacies, coaches of different stripes, people selling certification, people adapting their symptoms to go viral, so perhaps changing what we think about the symptoms of a particular condition. Some are selling merchandise in quite a reductionist way about biomarkers. This is your dopamine fix, and podcasts and books about hacking your hormones. And so much of our health seemed to be reduced online to very simple messaging. This is how to hack your hormones, your neurotransmitters, and your dopamine, your oxytocins, your serotonins, your HRT, testosterone. So we're sold these ideas of, you are broken and here's my protocol to fix it. And while that might have been going on in society in general, what social media I think has done is turbocharge that, and it's pretty much unfettered advertising. So can I have the next slide, please? I sound like Chris Whitty now, don't I, in the presses in the pandemic? Don't think he quite said it like that. So these are the push and pull factors. So the push factor. So why are people going to social media? And I think if we're going to think about how we address these issues, we really need to understand why people are turning to different platforms, not blame them, not point fingers. That's why I'm slightly uncomfortable at times using the term misinformation to point fingers at people. In one of the examples in my book, I interview young women that don't feel that they've had their full contraceptive choices explained to them, and have gone online to share that and have had fingers pointed at them saying you're spreading misinformation. Well, that doesn't draw them back into the health service. And I think we have to listen and understand why people go to these spaces in the first place. And a lot of the people that I've spoken to, and the research says that it's primarily rooted in systemic barriers. Those barriers can be all sorts of things, whether there's cultural, socioeconomic, declining trust, and patient experience, and this is a big one, of feeling unheard, or they don't get answers provided for their troubles. And we know a lot of symptoms go unexplained. Also, the NHS is experiencing an unprecedented crisis of faith, particularly in younger generations, and they're people most likely to use social media for health advice. And if you look online, there's terms like medical gaslighting trending, particularly young women, and those with unexplained physical symptoms. And it's not hard to see why, when there's big waiting lists for things like PCOS diagnoses or endometriosis, and or ADHD clinics, just to name a few examples. And when traditional systems cannot meet people's needs, private markets and social media influencers step into the void, and there's a rise of parallel authority online. And the pull factors and the commodified self we'll come on to a bit later. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is the prosumer effect. So I've worked as a journalist for many years, starting at the BMJ and for the BBC and ITV and across the board, really. And I know what goes into producing a bit of content. Now, here, what happens on social media, you've got something called the prosumer effect. So it's not only people are consumers of information, they help to change how information is handled. They're simultaneous producers and consumers. So they don't just receive medical advice from authorities, they contribute to knowledge ecosystem by sharing their own stories, reviews, their patient journeys, their ratings, their recommendations. And they build communities around specific conditions, and that can be a positive thing. When we saw in the pandemic, when people are isolated at home, social media, that really did TikTok really took off during the pandemic. People had the ability to communicate and find, if you were shielding, for example, there were ways of communicating with other people. There's people that find support, and I would never knock that there are online villages. But the problem is when that is exploited. And you can imagine some of the commercial incentives for developing this prosumer effect, for creating content, by monetizing your symptoms, by monetizing your illness, by monetizing your journey. and you're marketing your symptoms. And this has happened in things like the TikTok tics, where there was an explosion of tics during the pandemic that seemed like they were Tourette's, but they weren't. It was functional tics. And it was expression in a lot of young people of stress during a time when they saw loved ones dying and they weren't around their peers. And there was a wave of tics that spread across TikTok, and people emulated, the symptoms were very real and they emulated what they were seeing. But those influencers that were doing the tics in the first place, they were monetizing those symptoms and selling merch against them. So there are issues around the prosumer cycle when we are considering what the various commercial determinants of health are. Can I have the next slide, please? And what influencers do is they harness what's called a parasocial relationship. And this is a one-sided simulation of intimacy, where a social media follower develops a sense of closeness or perceived friendship with a content creator. And that's despite the creator not knowing them personally. And these digital relationships are built on relatability and perceived accessibility. And it's fundamentally one way, but they create an illusion of reciprocity. So they might interact with their audience through likes, comments, direct messages. And whereas a TV journalist, I might be directly broadcasting to an audience, and there isn't much relationship with me, although they were getting battered on X or Twitter, and I might respond. But these are actively created, and it doesn't feel like a top-down broadcast. And what creators do is they share deeply personal struggles, such as morning routines, mental health challenges, or chronic illnesses, which seems like you're providing a window into their life, but it's developing this sense of real friendship. And that friendship is created, this parasocial relationship, by a continuous flow of information. And this can be an extension of shadow advertising. Many influencers only show us what they want us to see, and many influencers fail to disclose whether a post is paid advertisement or whether it's paid advertising or whether it's not. Can I have the next slide, please? And there's a diverse range of celebrities. Obviously, we've got our mega celebrities like the Kardashians, and posts from them can cost hundreds of thousands, through to the podcast and longevity bros. And these are sort of hyper-capitalistic, they're predominantly male, who champion science-supported strategies to slow aging, often promoted complex protocols involving supplements and biohacking. Then we have the rise of patient influencers, and they use unbranded marketing campaigns. So that's disease awareness campaigns that actually might be used to push a particular pharmaceutical intervention. And they're increasingly used by the drug industry in the United States for direct-to-consumer advertising. And there are ways that these bans of direct-to-consumer advertising are got around in the rest of the world, the two countries, the United States and New Zealand, that allow direct-to-consumer advertising. And then one that really interested me is the big rise of the medical influencers. And these are qualified doctors, scientists, and medics who leverage credentials to establish unmatched authority. And they can command high fees too. And they worry me in a sense, because they lean into this parasocial relationship, I'm just like you, but at the same time create authority bias. And they have a wellness playbook. They use the same wellness playbook, except they can say, we're insiders of the health service, but now we're outsiders and we're going to tell you the truth. And they use that, and they may have the same sort of hero's journey where they have a personal crisis, and then they market supplements, or they market apps that go on your arm, or they market a clinic. And there's microbiome testing, whatever they have to test. But they're a particular concern because they use they feed into different biases. Can I have the next slide, please? And then we have AI influencers, which are a whole new issue that we'll be having to deal with. And if we look at, obviously, the hierarchy of evidence, as you all know, RCTs, observational studies, obviously you have the systematic reviews and meta-analyses at the top. But the way that the platforms prioritize evidence, it's very much emotional anecdotes, testimonials, cherry-picked abstracts, and obviously abstracts only tell us part of the story, as I go into in some detail in the book. And at the bottom we have much more nuanced information. And social media is like a testimonial factory. And added to this, you have the problem of what you call the illusory truth effect, where repeated exposure to a claim not everyone is affected by this, may make it feel like it's a fact. And obviously the posts often take an extreme. How often do you go on something and said, I took a drug and it was fine? You don't. You tend to have the extremes, as in, I love this drug, it was amazing. That often happens when you're talking about HRT, or I took this and it was toxic and it was awful. And you might see that with vaccines, say, for example. And so the nuanced information disappears. Okay, and next slide, please. And all this is taking a bit of a regulatory void. And the online health landscape is a bit of a wild west, and the safeguarding, the normal medical and advertising safeguards are often bypassed. And they're leaving consumers in a space where commercial interests are often indistinguishable from genuine advice. And it's really important that in terms of how the algorithms prioritize, the distinction between an organic post and an ad is critical, yet it's blurred online. The organic stuff is more likely to be aired. And as I've mentioned, influencers often fail to disclose whether they made a post. And that is in part because the authentic content is more recognized, is the algorithms prioritize the authentic content. Plus, audiences are more likely to scroll past content that they recognize as an ad. And if you can imagine how that plays against the parasocial relationships, it's an important factor in pulling people. We feel we've got this friendship, we listen to our friends when we make health decisions, but actually some of that content is actually commercially incentivized. And there's also something called borrowed legitimacy, and that's where someone like Davina McCall, say, for example, might use her TV legitimacy to promote stuff online that she wouldn't be allowed to in a much more regulated broadcast space. As a broadcast journalist on BBC, ITV, Sky, Channel 4 News, you're regulated by Ofcom, where a lot of this, so YouTube, fall outside the Ofcom code. And it's nearly impossible for the regulators to regulate all this, such as the volume of information. And one of the key things as well now is the interactions on DMs, and that is something that brands are particularly interested in, is what happens in the DMs, and regulators can't regulate those. They're very, very hard to regulate. So you can imagine the trouble in regulating this space. And then what we have, so can I have the next slide, please? So there we talked about the private messages. And then one of the ways of circumventing the ban on direct-to-consumer advertising, and pharmaceutical companies have a strict code about talking to patients, is online pharmacies and clinics use patient influencers, and they will offer discount codes for particular interventions. So what I've been looking at the moment is about egg freezing. Are offering discount codes to go to particular clinics for interventions that someone may or may not need. And we see that a lot with the GLP-1 drugs, where and this is actually illegal, but again, it's very, very hard to regulate, that they offer discount codes or bundle codes to particular pharmacies, and even get free drugs to promote the GLP-1, and that's really tricky. And when the Advertising Standards Authority have tried to clamp down, the influencers don't see what's happened, and the practice continues. So it is very, very difficult. Have the next slide, please. And then one thing that we've seen a lot online is sort of the turbocharge of preventive medicine, and this is sick until proven healthy. And this was a quote from Barry Kramer, who was head of the National Cancer Institute in the United States, that's done a lot of work around screening. And so there's a real big push of you're not well until you're not healthy until you've shown that you're healthy. And these are heavily marketed online. And next slide, please. And this is about full body MRI. So there's a big rise in full body MRI, and they're promoted by the likes of Kim Kardashian, who's described these scans as life-saving, and podcasters like Andrew Huberman, who literally told his millions of followers that we could all be walking around with tumours on the brain without even knowing. And there's big marketing towards the worried well. And again, influencers offer discount codes for these particular interventions, and there's no good evidence for them. And we know, the usual mantras: screening saves lives, early detection, empower yourself, knowledge is power, catch it early, peace of mind. And it's targeted to the worried well. So the people that are least likely to need, you can imagine who targeted these on social media. It's your 20, 30-year-olds. They're probably the least likely to need these particular interventions if they are needed at all. Next slide, please. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here. You've got there's a clinical cascade, and there's a real cost to over screening. You've got the risk of incidental findings, and they're the detection of harmless abnormalities that once spotted cannot be triggered, cannot be ignored, triggering a clinical cascade, leading to additional scans, biopsies, surgeries that can cause financial, psychological and physical harm. Another risk is overdiagnosis, transforming healthy people into patients by finding conditions that never cause them harm. And that has an impact on social inequality and what's been dubbed the wealth divide. So there's an impact of all this private screening. The affluent can pay for it, for the initial scans, and the NHS is left to pick up the pieces. And then the result of that is obviously people, there's a lack of resource, or it takes up precious resource, and people that need being seen can't necessarily get seen. Next slide, please. And then following on from that is the idea of optimization, and the idea that every single part of your body can be optimized and scanned and measured, whether that's glucose spikes, normal fluctuation in hormones, fatigue, all in a healthy population. And we've seen the rise of this on social media as well, with they're turning monitoring into competitive sports, high profile figures like Kim Kardashian and Gwyneth Paltrow, sharing granular data like sleep scores. And a lot of the influencers and podcasters have direct commercial interests with these particular companies. And we've seen with the glucose monitors, and I'm not talking people with type 1, type 2 diabetes that might be that use insulin, that need to monitor their glucose levels. These are well people. And there's a much bigger market in well people. And wellness for apps are not regulated, and devices are not regulated in the same way as they are for things for sick people. They are medical devices when they're used for people with type 1, type 2 diabetes. They're wellness devices, and the MHRA isn't as interested in them as they are and all the FDA in the United States is interested in them as medical devices. And they're sold as empowerment tools. This is how you empower yourself: measure your glucose, measure your sleep, measure your heart rate variability. And you can imagine there's all sorts of problems that lead to that, particularly when these tests are not validated or evidence-based for particular biometrics. We don't know what they do in the short term, nor do we know what measuring them do in the long term. And the interventions, say for continuous glucose monitoring, I spoke to plenty of clinicians where people were not stopping eating fruit and instead eating burgers because it didn't spike their glucose. Again, all promoted by influencers, commercial incentives behind it all. Next slide, please. I'm nearly finished. I've probably totally run over, so it's cut me off if I have. And this one, and then we've seen this increased medicalization of normalcy as well, where there's normal human experiences are increasingly marketable as diagnoses. So whether that's self-diagnosed ADHD, a proliferation of questionnaires online, menopause, ADHD, and so on and so forth. And they lean into something called the Barnum effect. So what they do is they'll say, this is a whole range of symptoms. You know what happens when you read the horoscope? There's always one or two things that you think that are like you, and you think, well, I'm Sagittarius, and those things are my horoscope. That's me. That must be true. It's similar with ADHD. So they list all these symptoms that are not in the DSM, but they seem like they are part of ADHD, and people recognize it, and there's increased. And what studies have shown is people that do not have ADHD that are shown these videos think that perhaps they do have ADHD. And a lot of these questionnaires, they're selling supplements, they're selling coaching, they're selling all sorts of other merch around ADHD. And last slide, and then I'm done, and I'm so sorry for running over. And this all to say is we're really in one big global public health experiment, and we've blindly applied a system designed to sell advertising and maximize engagement to the complexities of human biology. And I sort of liken it, this is where the commercial determinants of health meets the digital determinants of health. And that's me done. I've gone well over, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Deborah.
You need to cut me off.
No, that was great. I didn't want to stop you in full flow, and I could see that
you should have done just.
So building to
I should be better at timing. I'm used to doing it.
But I think there are lots of common themes there. And I think the thing that you emphasized that also came through very strongly from Marco's is the exploitation of the public and the commercial incentives to promote misinformation. I suppose that's the conflict of interest issue. And also the commercial incentives to promote uncertainty about your own health status. So I think I'm not expecting you to solve all of these problems, Nason, but I think, Nason, you're going to pull some of these threads together with some ways forward. So over to Nason, who's a senior lecturer in Inequalities and Global Health Policy at the University of Edinburgh in the Global Health Policy Unit. And he's also Deputy Director of Local Health and Global Profits. And his research, we've done a lot together across different industries, focuses on commercial determinants of health and the mechanisms through which commercial actors affect health inequalities, knowledge and public discourse. So Nason, I think you're going to give us a few ways forward in 15 minutes.
Yeah, well, I'll try and go as fast as I can. Thank you very much. And I guess I've really gotten the sort of the short end of the stick here, because this is a really knotty, complex problem, as the fantastic presentations you've heard so far have outlined. So there's no real easy way to do this, but what I thought might be nice to very quickly go through, and hopefully we have some time for questions, is to briefly talk about what's already underway in terms of actions, initiatives to try and deal with some of these issues, what's missing or absent from those currently, and that will hopefully lead us to think a little bit about what else might be possible, and that might address some of the questions that have already come up in the Q&A box about what kind of things might work. So yeah, hopefully through discussing these three things, we can have a think about a way forward, and I'll have addressed the very difficult brief that I was given. I must have done something wrong to someone in the organizing team. So a really good place to start, and I've tried to include as many links as possible for any of you who are interested in finding out more about where we are in the UK in terms of what we consider health mis and disinformation, what we consider harmful in the context of social media algorithms and that kind of thing. It's really worth looking at the 3 reports produced by the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee, the Parliamentary Committee, and the responses received from government and Ofcom about these. So the committee has these large reports that have pulled together expert testimony and that kind of thing. And then you have the responses from the government, and they give you a really good sense of what the UK government views as its role when it comes to misinformation, what it views as harmful, and what it views as not kind of its priority or responsibility. So just to pull a few quotes from the most recent report, which was very, very recent, just a few months ago, there's this interesting tension between what the government views as its responsibility and what it's really up for platforms and providers to do in terms of countering the spread of mis and disinformation. So there's a little bit of kind of grayness around whose responsibility some of these things are. There's also a lot of emphasis on kind of trade-offs and freedom of speech, and you'll have seen some of the kind of really quite intense debate around Online Safety Act and this notion that we need to balance restricting harmful content, however that's defined, and freedom of expression. And this is an area where commercial disinformation kind of perhaps deliberately falls into this gray area of kind of benefiting from the kind of notions of freedom, protecting freedom of expression, while also not quite falling into the government's definition of harmful content online. And I guess to kind of get to where it seems that the government is at the moment around this is recognizing mis and disinformation is broad, cross-cutting, but choosing or claiming to focus on the most prevalent and concerning harms associated with mis and disinformation. And one of the things they often refer to, even though it isn't directly applicable, is the Online Safety Act, which many of you will be familiar with. So that requires platforms to assess the risks of harmful or illegal content, mitigate those risks, and be accountable to Ofcom. And in theory, Ofcom has investigative and kind of powers to fine platforms. But the focus is very, very narrow. It's on particular content that's considered illegal and harmful, such as content harmful to children. And that's why you've heard a lot of emphasis on, for example, age gateways to things like pornography sites and that kind of thing. The Online Safety Act itself doesn't really directly cover mis and disinformation in the ways that we've been talking about it in this webinar. And because of that, it kind of falls into this middle ground in terms of regulation, where there's a kind of a gap, right? It's falling into this kind of gap where advertising is typically self-regulated or is focused on kind of traditional media forms. Online harm is kind of very narrowly defined, and as a result, most health disinformation, what we've been talking about, falls into this middle legal, not well regulated, not well understood area. And other than the Online Safety Act in the UK, but also around the world, a lot of emphasis on how to deal with this problem has focused on digital literacy, research, and transparency. And again, I've included links to some kind of policy documents and guides from the EU, the US, and the UK for those of you who are interested in reading more about this. So it's really focused on literacy and transparency rather than enforcement or kind of more structural reforms. And just to take an example from, I guess, what is the most innocuous angle that this is taken is to look at the US government's approach from 2021. This is from the US Surgeon General's advisory on confronting health misinformation. And you can see that almost all of what it's proposing is actually for governments, for public health teams at local, state, national level to provide technical assistance, to provide new types of health promotion messaging, essentially. So not really about addressing misinformation at source, but more about just providing information, a bit like what Marco was talking about. And this is also replicated in recent policy documents from the UK government. So this is from last week, a policy paper on a safe, informed digital nation. The policy paper does touch on misinformation and disinformation and health in the context of health as well. But when you look at where the focus is for the next few years, it's around building literacy, preparing children for a digital future, boosting local initiatives to kind of emphasize the positive aspects of being digitally connected, and kind of this kind of idea of a multi-sectoral collaboration. So it's not really about addressing misinformation at source. And as Marco mentioned, there is this other issue that the solutions tend to focus on partnership and avoid consideration of advertising. So advertising related mis and disinformation does come up in the select committee's kind of questions to witnesses and so on, but not really in the government responses to that. It seems like something that's really being left out. And it seems to reflect the structural power of platforms as economic actors, really big economic actors, but also as advertising platforms. So even sort of advertising industry self-regulatory efforts, there was this global effort by advertisers to try and make sure that social media platforms weren't putting their adverts alongside overt hate speech, because that was a real concern for advertisers. They were appearing alongside really kind of extreme, violent or otherwise really damaging content. And as Marco was saying, sometimes they're not necessarily aware of where their adverts are appearing. But even that kind of self-regulatory effort was ultimately abandoned by global advertisers because of pressure from, legal pressure from Twitter, basically. And it's quite telling when you look at some of the oral evidence to parliamentary committee about this from advertisers. It kind of acknowledges the power asymmetry because, as the Director General of the Society of British Advertisers says, if you put yourselves in our shoes, it's very hard to walk away from spending with a major platform that has such a large audience, particularly among younger people, particularly when traditional media is losing its grip. So in essence, the power isn't necessarily even with the advertisers, it's with the platform because of the engagement and the power of the advertising tools that they can sort of bring to bear. And that imbalance is reflected in the nature of partnerships with health authorities. So these are ones that Marco also mentioned, these kind of focusing on health promotion and appearing on these platforms rather than addressing misinformation that also appears on these platforms. And the problem with that is that if you're just kind of trying to make sure that your messages appear on a platform and not kind of considering the breadth and the scale and the targeted nature of disinformation or misinformation, including health-related misinformation or advertising-mediated misinformation, then you're kind of ignoring the fundamental business model. And as coverage in last week's BBC News has shown from whistleblowers, there is this active algorithm arms race where these companies are competing with each other to maximize engagement. And they're very aware internally that outrage, as Marco mentioned, is a big driver there. So if you're not dealing with a fundamental business model, ultimately, you're not really dealing with the harms at source. And that makes it a new version of the old public health challenge, right? Like that, this is like our public health challenge with any other health problem. Approaches over focus on downstream individual behavior change because the industry is happy to partner, little to no disruption of underlying business model. It's easily quantifiable, so that's very kind of alluring. The idea that governments and other actors can say, look, we reached X people, Y impressions in Z locations. And so, yeah, essentially the social media companies are saying, here's a watering can, you can sprinkle some truth on a few, on a few people, and we can count that for you. But just don't ignore our fire hose and what we're kind of firing at them at the same time. And I guess that runs a real risk that accurate information, it becomes like vestigialized amidst the fire hose of falsehood, and kind of any efforts that we do to kind of just put out health promotion on these platforms becomes kind of almost performative and not necessarily that beneficial. So what are some alternatives? We categorized in a recent paper, a review that we did on the politics and profit of disinformation in public health, a few areas of action that have shown some promise and that could be carried over to social media or further developed. The first is pre-bunking, or the concept of psychologically inoculating people before they're exposed to mis or disinformation, rather than waiting for people to sort of deal with the misinformation, potentially become convinced by it, and then trying to convince them otherwise. And it's been applied in relation to both specific arguments on specific topics, but also sources. So it could include warning the public of potential sources of disinformation, like state actors or influencers of certain types. It could include sharing known tactics of disinformation, like forms of persuasion. And it has been shown to be effective in relation to climate denialism. And there's some really interesting example videos that you can go and see that have been designed so that they introduce the public to concepts like false dichotomies or cherry picking or emotive arguments or arguing from anecdote and that kind of thing. And you could see how this could very easily be carried across to actually apply to the format of social media content itself, like thinking about why you're seeing what you're seeing on a particular algorithm, thinking about what platforms you're using and why, what their incentives are, and so on. Another approach is counter-marketing or denormalization. So this goes to one of the questions in the chat, is using health communications to directly expose the motives and marketing practices of the producers of harmful products, or in this case, even of social media companies themselves. And there's like a clear rationale for doing that in terms of what we've heard so far, the sources of their revenue, the amount of the ways in which they rely on harmful use, the ways in which they rely on young people and deceptive marketing practices. And there is a literature on the effectiveness of counter-marketing approaches, a lot of it coming from tobacco. So, kind of the idea of the Marlboro cowboy and sort of like kind of building advertising campaigns around that really sort of focus on dismantling that kind of image. And I think there has been really interesting progress on denormalization of kind of health misinformation through initiatives like IMARC. The Alcohol Forum Ireland's efforts to sort of make sure that any charities communicating on alcohol have a mark of independence that shows that they don't receive any alcohol industry funding. And in doing so, it kind of denormalizes the alcohol industry's funding of health information. Now, the other big area that I'm sure you're interested in hearing about is, what about regulation? What about structural change? What about structural reform? And I think my kind of top line read of the landscape at the moment is that we're very early on in the cycle of regulation. So a good example would be the EU Digital Services Act, which gives the EU power to impose fines of up to 6% of global turnover, to impose suspension of service on platforms that breach quite narrow definitions of harmful content, but the DSA takes a much more kind of structural view of risk compared to UK legislation. So it's more around platforms, practices, rather than just specific types of harmful content or misinformation. So in theory, the DSA gives the EU investigative power, especially over very large online platforms, to compel access to their data and algorithms, to make them mandate them to do annual risk assessments, to audit them, to appear at their offices for on-site inspections, to interview their staff. So in theory, that's quite a powerful toolkit to kind of rein in some of these companies, and it's at a sort of supranational scale in the context of the EU. So that's an example of a set of tools that, if it can be done for narrowly defined harmful illegal content, could it be expanded for commercial disinformation systems more broadly, things like algorithmic filtering or targeted harmful advertising. The challenge is that it's still quite early on in its life cycle. So investigations that haven't been initiated are really focused on data collection still, rather than moving to enforcement. So it's early on, and there are lots of other challenges, as you can imagine. Some challenges for regulators at this early stage are, as I mentioned, narrow definitions of harm in relation to misinformation. It's early in the enforcement cycle, so cases are in the data collection phase. It's quite possible that a lot more will be revealed through these. What more about that due to public opinion or political will, demand for further action? It's hard to know. But that's challenging because of the amount of data involved. But also, any regulator has to deal with within company opposition. So these companies are very well resourced. There's a lot of revolving door going on. They're very good at sort of stalling and opposing transparency. But also, regulators have to deal with geopolitical tensions. A lot of social media and tech companies are US dominated in terms of their shareholders, their ownership, and that creates kind of these power asymmetries and carve-outs and political pressures, which are also very challenging. There's also a high level of information and technical expertise asymmetry, as you can imagine. So inside companies, they're that have these kind of algorithm-driven business models. It's fast-moving. There's a kind of black box around the algorithms. There's security versus health trade-offs. So parts of government are very keen to work with these companies for monitoring hate speech, for monitoring potential, for counterterrorism purposes, that kind of thing. State actors. And so they're kind of nervous about going after them for other issues. And just the sheer data volumes are also really vast. And further complicating this is the rise of AI and digital infrastructure, because some of these big companies, governments are also quite reliant on them, either relying on them to carry forward and invest in AI and infrastructure, or relying on them for parts of their kind of cloud computing and that kind of thing. So that makes it even more complicated. Some of these companies are essentially part of government infrastructure as well as platforms that they're trying to regulate. So in summary, I think the top line that I would take from this whole webinar, which came through all three, I think, presentations, we cannot out-communicate a system designed around maximizing engagement and ad revenue. I think that's just not really possible. We need to move upstream, either by drawing more attention to that system and the business models underpinning it, seeking to redress balance between public-private power in this space, and actively pre-bunking and inoculating against disinformation where we can. If you're interested in finding more about ways around this and like how we could define disinformation in this kind of modern information ecosystem, I encourage you to read our review article, an annual review of public health, which is free to access. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues for helping put some of this thought together. If you're interested on these kind of themes, you can check out the podcast and the Substack. And we also have a book which touches on some of these themes and commercial tournaments more broadly, coming out this time next year. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nason. And just to say, you mentioned the podcast. I strongly urge people to listen to the Money Power Health podcast. It is fantastic. The speakers across the months have been absolutely brilliant. So it's one of the things that I listen to and re-listen to. We've lots of questions. We've only got 10 minutes or so. So I think what I'll do is there's one sort of common theme in the questions relating to structural approaches to dealing with misinformation. And I think you've addressed quite a bit of that, Nason, but there's another question which people have about what you can do at the local level. You alluded to it in your talk, but this is a question for others as well. What can you do, for example, at a local public health practice level, or if you're a member of the public? So maybe if you can, I'm sure you've thought about that, Nason, I can pass it to Marco and Deborah.
Yeah, I can start off. I think there are some tools already that I think are quite helpful. So at the local authority level, I think the toolkits that are being produced by DPH and others, in terms of they're almost a form of pre-bunking in themselves, and like getting in early with councillors, with colleagues at local authority to kind of articulate some of the dis and misinformation that they're likely to encounter when in office. I think that's really good to get that out in early, and that's an example of what local authority, of what people can do in local authorities, and actually priming people in those kind of positions for online disinformation and misinformation as well. I think that's an example of stuff that can be done. I think the other area that a lot of the literature touches on is almost like before pre-bunking is building and maintaining trust in public health and in authorities from the community, if that makes sense. And that's really something that I think local public health teams are better placed to do in some ways than national organizations, because they have direct links, they're on the ground, they're visible. Those would be two areas I think where local public health practitioners can have a lot of input. I think it becomes more difficult when you're dealing with online environments, because they're hard to regulate or to engage with even at the national level, just because they have, they're so cross-border in a way. But those are a couple of ideas.
Thanks, Nason. So the toolkit that Nason refers to is the ADP Association of Directors of Public Health. It's the Good Governance Toolkit. I think I've put the link in the chat, and Laura has just sent it to everyone. Thanks, Nason. I think those are great practical starting points. And the I mark, as you mentioned earlier as well, I think has been fantastic, as an indicator of, if you Google I mark alcohol, as a sort of marker of independence from the alcohol industry. And Laura has just sent that to everyone as well. Someone's also asked a question, Deborah, about having finished your book. What is it that gave you hope? And it might be a useful thing to consider.
Gosh, give me hope. I'm an investigative journalist. I'm used to breaking stuff and pointing out what's bad. You see that's coming. I think there is, what gives me hope, I think there are good communicators online. I think competing against and again, it's hard to know whether this is or misses disinformation. This is marketing. Where does this fit into it all? And how you define mis and disinformation, it's commercial, it's commercially orientated information. Where does this sit in it all? And I'm not always entirely sure. Is talking anecdotally, this thing helped me before the clinical, let's say in glucose monitors, this helped me before the clinical trial is finished. Is that all disinformation? I don't know the answer to this. So did it, I think, is there hope? There are communities online that I think really support. I quote Liz O'Riordan, who's a breast surgeon and had breast cancer herself, and she found great communities of support when she had breast cancer, people that sent her tips when she had nausea and sickness from chemotherapy, and sent her, knitted blankets and books to read. So she developed really good communities. I know on social media during the pandemic, when I was reporting for Newsnight, I developed good friendships from Twitter, or X as it is now, and we were supporting each other and providing information. So I think there are good things in there, and I'd hate to denigrate it completely, but there are challenges with how information is presented and covert advertising. Sometimes it's overt, but a lot of the time it's covert, and promotion of interventions that that lack any evidence, and how laws that are in place already, like the direct-to-consumer advertising ban on prescription drugs, how easily they are flouted. So I don't know. I think, is there any hope? I mean, I guess my dream would be, and I say this as boring old mainstream media, is it might be social media is so flooded with AI dupes that we don't really know who's to trust. So we go back to the old mainstream media again. I'm not saying that's always a good thing when it comes to health, but it's possibly better than the alternatives. So I've got no crystal ball, but it's quite icky. I think it's fair to say. And there are some very good people on there who communicate well, but they're inevitably outflanked by the sort of more extreme comms, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and by the fire hose that Nason talked about.
Yeah.
It's a great metaphor, actually, because you can immediately see how to deal with a fire hose. You step on the fire hose, or you turn off the top, or you tell people stay away from particular fire hoses.
I think what's going to happen is brands are going to become very, very important. And, you know, if you have a good brand in inverted commas, and I don't mean brand, we're talking sort of Nike or whatever else, but as a communicator, or if you are a platform like Channel 4 News, or you're the BBC or someone like that, and I know people have mixed views on the BBC, but brands will become very, very important.
So that leads quite nicely, I think, into another question, which I think Emma Eves Anderson, it was a question for Marco really about social media use for children and how we educate and what the content of the education might be. I mean, it also applies to others as well, because Emma has quite a nice point, which is that should there also be teaching on business models, consumerism, capitalism through a social justice lens as a way to protect and inform young people? So I think that's that's reaching much beyond the issue of misinformation, but about thinking about what one teaches children about the sort of society they live in. Actually, that's a huge question, Marco. Despite that, I've got to pass it to you.
Yeah, I think, you know, my answer to this is maybe less academic. It's more of my opinion on this. I study mainly mis and disinformation with digital platforms, so I also don't want to present myself as more of an expert in this area. But I do think we have to give maybe young people just a bit more credit as well when it comes to these things. I think a lot of the mobilization we see with young people actually starts with young people. So I do think that, you know, maybe when we talk about what we could do to support young people, and I agree, I think, you know, any kind of digital literacy, of course, is helpful, making sure people understand, you know, those business models. And but I also would say that I think many young people already know these things. I think this is actually probably more something that we teach people who aren't kids, if I'm completely honest. So I do think maybe it's less about sometimes, you know, trying to tell kids things, but maybe supporting what they think with a lot of this. And that's why, you know, when I see a lot of this advocacy right now about, you know, banning phones, banning social media, all of those things, I think it kind of misses the mark, if I'm completely honest. I don't think that's what young people want. I don't think, you know, that's the best solution either. But maybe kind of a cop-out answer, maybe we should just listen to young people a bit more with what they need with social media, because I think they have a better idea than we do.
I think that's a really helpful point to end on, Marco, and also to think about the public voice in all of this, which is the other undercurrent that I think is run through the talks. I think, unfortunately, we have to wrap up there. I think, you know, the questions in the chat or the Q&A, there's material there for another hour's discussion. That's been really fantastic. But thanks ever so much to the speakers and for your presentations. Thanks to the attendees. If I could ask you to complete the survey that will appear in your browser after you leave the session, that would be very helpful to us. And just to say, Nason, if I ever am on a webinar with you and you have a ukulele in the background and you don't play it, there's going to be trouble. I think Chekhov had a comment about that in relation to a gun on the wall and a play. By the end of the play, the gun has to be fired.
That's fair. That's fair.
You're off the hook this time. Thank you again to everybody. Just a reminder to follow Local Health Global Profits on social media and sign up to the to the newsletter, and then you can stay up to date with further events, further webinars and progress with projects. And Laura has just put links for this in the chat. So thanks again to our fantastic speakers and for the amount of sheer, maybe enthusiasm isn't the word, but sheer thought and understanding that they've given to this and conveyed to the rest of us. So thanks to everybody, and thanks to everyone for joining, and have a good rest of the evening. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.